T paradoxo ononotasis. Every nation you can name, powerful or poor, stable or struggling, is drowning in debt. The United States owes tens of trillions. Japan's debt surpasses the size of its entire economy. Globally, humanity is chained to more than 315 trillion, an amount so enormous that no spreadsheet, no budget meeting, no election manifesto can even pretend to solve it. But here's what almost nobody stops to ask: if everyone owes money, then who is the world actually indebted to? Who is the invisible lender collecting interest from every continent? The answer is not another country. It isn't a king or a corporation or a billionaire sitting on a golden throne. The world owes money to itself, and yet interest flows upward, constantly, predictably, forever. That sounds impossible until you trace the origins of this machine. Because the truth is, chilling debt was not a mistake. Debt was engineered. 3 centuries, 4 men, 4 turning points. Each of them solved a financial crisis in their era, and each solution tightened the trap for every generation that followed. Not through conspiracy, not through secret societies, but through decisions recorded in government archives, parliamentary minutes, banking ledgers, documents anyone can read. Yet almost no one understands. Today, people debate debt as if it were a problem. But once you see how the system was built, you finally understand debt is not a problem. Debt is the product. Debt is the economy. Debt is the cage. And the architects designed it so escape was mathematically impossible. Let's go back, not to the beginning of debt, but to the moment it stopped being temporary and became permanent. Tichi Menduyo Medibi Etrnls Patterson. Before the late 1600s, kings borrowed money like ordinary people. They visited wealthy merchants, begged for loans, promised repayment, and often failed to deliver. Lenders lost their fortunes. Monarchs lost their reputations. But debt, at least, was finite. It either got repaid or it died with the king. Then came one man, William Paterson, a restless Scottish merchant with more failed ventures than successful ones. Yet it was his financial imagination, not his businesses, that changed the world. In the early 1690s, England was bleeding money. War with France had drained the treasury. Taxes weren't enough. The government was desperate. Paterson approached King William III with a proposal so radical it shocked Parliament. "We'll lend the crown a huge sum. The crown pays interest forever. The loan never has to be repaid. A never-ending debt." In return, Paterson proposed something new, an institution to manage this immortal loan, the Bank of England. Merchants would hand over their gold. The new bank would lend it to the government. The government would pay interest every single year, and the principal, the original amount, would remain untouched for eternity. Why would lenders agree? Because the interest was backed by the government's power to tax the entire population. As long as England existed, as long as taxes could be collected, the interest stream was guaranteed. Parliament approved it in 1694. That approval was the birth of something entirely new: perpetual national debt. The money from the loan funded England's war. The interest enriched the merchant lenders. And the Bank of England, backed by the government's never-ending IOU, gained the right to create money. Debt became currency. Currency became debt. Paterson likely never realized it, but he had invented the foundation of modern finance. Government borrows. G never repays. D pays interest forever. Debt becomes money. Every major European power copied the model within decades. The United States adopted it after independence, and the world has been living inside Paterson's blueprint for 331 years. He died without great fortune, but his system became the skeleton of global debt, the trapdoor no nation can close. Tichi dynastia mabi gobi. Rothschild Paterson made debt permanent. Nathan Rothschild made debt inescapable. In the early 1800s, Europe was a battlefield. Wars destroyed treasuries. Governments were constantly borrowing. But the debt markets were slow, inefficient, and local. Then came the Rothschild network. 5 brothers operating in 5 critical capitals: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples. They created the first truly international financial web. Money could move across borders faster than armies. Nathan Rothschild, based in London, took the system to its next stage. Instead of merely lending money, he transformed government debt into a tradable commodity. Buy bonds from governments at a discount. Resell them across Europe, profit from the spread, repeat on massive scale. This created something new. A global secondary market for sovereign debt. Governments could now borrow instantly. Investors could trade bonds like currency. And Rothschild became the gateway through which nations accessed money. Then came Waterloo. Nathan learned of Napoleon's defeat before the British government did. His intelligence network was faster than generals, diplomats, and kings. He used this information to trigger a panic. He quietly sold British bonds. The market assumed Britain had lost, prices collapsed, investors panicked. Then, he bought huge quantities at rock bottom prices. When the true victory news reached London, bond prices surged. His profit was immeasurable. But the real consequence was structural. After Waterloo, governments realized something terrifying. Default was no longer a local problem. Default would crash the entire European financial network. Because Rothschild had made debt so interconnected, so widely held, that a single sovereign default could create continental collapse. This was his invisible innovation: make the financial system so interwoven that governments lose the option to walk away. Permanent debt became inescapable debt. By the mid-1800s, the Rothschilds were richer than any king. Their wealth didn't come from producing goods or building cities. It came from interest, the quiet, steady river of payments from governments chained to bonds they could no longer escape. The trap was now global. Morgan. By 1900, the United States had become an industrial giant, but its financial system was still fragmented. Banks failed often. Money supplies fluctuated, and there was no central authority to stabilize panics. Then came the panic of 1907. Banks collapsed, markets plunged, depositors rioted. One man stopped the catastrophe: J.P. Morgan. Inside his library, he locked the leading bankers in a room and forced them to contribute their own funds to save the system. He acted like a one-man central bank. But Morgan was aging, and he understood something crucial: America needed a mechanism that could create money on command and guarantee liquidity forever. So he helped engineer one. In 1910, under absolute secrecy, Morgan's allies, including Senator Nelson Aldrich and top Wall Street bankers, met on Jekyll Island to design what became the Federal Reserve System. They hid the plan from the public because Americans despised central banks. So they rebranded it not a central bank, but a reserve system. And not one institution, but 12 districts seemingly controlled by government, but structurally owned by banks. The genius was subtle. Member banks owned the regional Federal Reserve banks. Those banks elected the regional boards, and those regional boards influenced the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. It looked democratic, but real control flowed upward from the banking sector. Then came the critical power. The Federal Reserve could create money to buy government bonds. This was the final evolution of Paterson's idea. Before the Fed, government borrowing was limited. There were only so many lenders. After the Fed, borrowing became infinite. The government issues bonds. The Fed buys them with created money. The money enters the economy. The debt grows. Interest flows to the institutions holding those bonds. And because the Fed can always buy more, the U.S. government can never run out of credit. Morgan died in 1913, the year the Federal Reserve Act passed. But the system he helped shape became the engine behind the $38 trillion in U.S. debt today. Without the Federal Reserve, such massive borrowing would collapse markets. With the Federal Reserve, there is no theoretical ceiling. Debt became limitless. By the 1970s, the global financial world functioned on the Paterson, Rothschild-Morgan architecture. Rich countries borrowed endlessly. Poor countries borrowed for development. Interest payments circled the globe like blood pumping through veins. Then inflation hit. Oil prices soared. Confidence in the U.S. dollar was collapsing. Enter Paul Volcker, Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979. His decision: Raise interest rates to a level no modern economy had ever seen. The federal funds rate hit 20%. Borrowing froze, inflation died. But something else died with it. The ability of developing countries to repay their loans. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, nations that had borrowed heavily in the 1970s suddenly saw their interest costs triple or quadruple. By 1982, Mexico declared it could not pay. This should have detonated the global banking system. American banks would have drowned in losses. Volcker had a choice: let the banks fail, or keep the machine alive. He chose the machine. Through the International Monetary Fund, he orchestrated a new system. Loans would not be forgiven. They would be restructured. Countries would borrow more to pay interest on old debt. And in exchange, they would surrender economic policy to the IMF. This was the birth of structural adjustment. Cut public services, privatize state industries, open markets to foreign investors, devalue currencies, reduce sovereignty not to reduce debt, but to ensure interest payments never stop. This model has been repeated for decades. Greece, Argentina, Turkey, Sri Lanka, many others. When countries can't pay, they aren't allowed to default. They are refinanced into perpetual dependency. Volcker didn't invent the debt trap. He made it global and unbreakable. TTS wastem tiabil. Let's assemble the machine the four architects created. 1. Paterson, 1694, make government debt permanent. No principal repayment. Interest forever. 2. Rothschild's 1800s make debt global and interconnected. Default becomes too dangerous to allow. 3. Morgan, 1913, that gives central banks power to create money. Infinite demand for government bonds. 4. Volcker, 1980s, when countries fail, restructure. Don't forgive. Debt becomes eternal together. These mechanisms produce the world we live in. $15 trillion in global debt. None of it designed to be repaid. All of it generating interest. Governments owe corporations. Banks owe governments. Individuals owe banks. Banks hold government bonds. Governments borrow to pay interest on earlier borrowing. It is a closed circuit, a loop, a self-sustaining cage. Why can't governments pay their debt off? Because debt is the money supply. If the U.S. eliminated its debt, dollars would vanish. The financial system would collapse instantly. If the world paid off its debt, global money supply would shrink by 2/3. Trade would freeze. Banks would fail. Countries would fall into depression. The system requires debt to survive. Who benefits? The institutions that hold the bonds. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, major banks, pension funds, insurance companies. These institutions hold tens of trillions in government bonds. They earn interest every year. U.S. taxpayers alone send about $1 trillion in interest annually. Not to services, not to infrastructure, not to citizens, but to institutions that own the debt. This is the largest wealth transfer on earth, and it is continuous, silent, and legal. Lope lao can't excite. Most people assume debt is temporary, a bill that will eventually be paid. But national debt isn't a bill, it's a business model. Government debt creates the money supply, the banking system's collateral, the basis for pensions, the foundation of insurance funds, the structure of global trade, the flows of international finance. Debt is not an accident. It is the architecture. And interest is the rent humanity pays to exist inside that architecture. If the system ever tried to escape the trap, it wouldn't just free itself, it would collapse. That's the final lock the architects built. The trap is mfntoying itis fun toying pyre ffitly 4 men. 3 centuries, 1 machine. Paterson made debt permanent. Rothschild made it international. Morgan made it infinite. Volcker made it unavoidable. Today, governments debate deficits as if they're mistakes. Politicians argue over budgets as if spending were the issue. But the machine doesn't care about spending. It cares about interest. Debt isn't a flaw in the system. Debt is the system. And interest is the quiet river of wealth flowing to the architect's successors, the modern institutions that hold the world's bonds. Once you understand this, you stop seeing $38 trillion as a crisis. You start seeing it as deliberate design. If you want to understand how power works, how the modern world was built, then you must understand this. You don't escape the debt system by paying it off. You escape it by realizing it was never meant to end.